Hello and welcome to Turkey Today. Once more, the subject is the approaching upcoming Turkish elections, both presidential elections and parliament elections. My guest is from Washington, D.C., Sinan Ciddi, Turkey Program Director of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD. Welcome, Sinan.
Good to be with you, thanks.
Okay, let's start with the overall view. Your meeting, your panel in the FTD with participants Barki, Tahiroğlu, and Şenkan was very interesting. It was giving a broad view over what is to take place, but that was a while ago. So we have now 3 weeks to go to the existential elections called and defined as referendum for the Turkey's future in its centennial. Very coincidental. Did your views expressed in the FTD, you were cautious, you were questioning, skeptical at certain aspects? Did your view changed about the outlook of the upcoming elections?
That's a good question, and you're right. It was a long time ago, but I think the underlying sort of cautious to pessimistic sort of perspective on what we expect to be the outcome of Turkey's presidential elections is basically still there. I am obviously on record for suggesting and still thinking that Tayyip Erdogan still maintains a healthy ability and a likely ability to remain in power sometime either after the first or second round. My judgment is possibly second round. I'm more certain about the outcome of the parliamentary elections, which is obviously going to be determined at the end of the first round, whereby essentially I think the opposition nation alliance will fail to gain the 400 minimum seats required to essentially ensure that they will have enough seats to change the constitution such that Turkey can be reinstated back to a parliamentary democracy. So I think the underlying causes are still there, and this is despite some recent developments since the panel. We obviously thought at that point that the fallout from the earthquake, the political fallout from the earthquake, which obviously inflamed a lot of public opinion even further against the government and Tayyip Erdogan's rule, suggesting that it was just incapable, but it was also maybe symbolic of its inability to govern the country, would have detrimental causes to it in the ballot box. I say that because if we go by recent polling data, which I obviously do not necessarily lend a lot of credibility to, mainly because I see just basically what they put out as, large margins of error, which to me suggests lack of methodology or reach to a representative portion of sampling, suggests that the race is neck and neck, that despite the public anger that initially put itself out there after the earthquake, Erdogan does still maintain a considerable amount of performance and inspires confidence on the part of the electorate as we're leading into the final stretch of the race.
Let's stay at the parliament elections leg of the elections overall. You mentioned the objective as 400 seats, which is crucial for a constitutional amendment. But I don't hear any voice from the opposition bloc, centristic or central opposition bloc, about this objective anymore. It's rather gaining a majority in parliament, which means that it may end with a lot of question marks about how the transition to a strengthened parliamentary administration will take place. And a lot of people these days, also 3 weeks to go to the elections, started speaking about the next elections, maybe within a year or so, because if the opposition gains a majority, tiny majority, however, and Kılıçdaroğlu becomes elected as president, the opposition will have inherited a massive rubble in terms of economic as a result of economic mismanagement. So that seems to be a more realistic scenario regarding the parliamentary elections, neck and neck, as you mentioned, but it is still an open open-ended race whereby AKP, MHP, the current ruling coalition, may also gain 300 plus seats. So it's open.
Yeah, I mean, look, I absolutely believe that's the case, and not because I'm just sort of like shaking a magic 8 ball and thinking what's going to come out of this. Look, since the earthquake, the government is on record for essentially taking provisions to ensure that, for example, the earthquake-stricken zones where voters have been dispersed and sort of relocated to other cities, measures have been put in such that their votes will not necessarily be counted in the places that they were once domiciled. There are structural sort of measures being taken to ensure that the distribution of seats based on the Hunt system of voting will not translate into a favorable outcome for the opposition, and the opposition knows this. And the reason why, just to basically echo what you're suggesting, which is the opposition doesn't seem to be too concerned about the distribution of seats in Parliament, is because I would say, I'm not the only one to say this, they don't really care about having a super majority in Parliament to change the constitution back to a to take the country back to a parliamentary system. They care about how many seats they're going to get, right? If the goal from the outset for the political opposition under the umbrella of the Nation Alliance was returning Turkey back to a democratic system of governance that undercut the rule of one person or one man, right? Then we would have seen several things. First of all, we would not have seen such a big concentration of sort of effort into determining who the presidential candidate was. Specifically, the amount of effort that has gone into trying to nominate Kılıçdaroğlu, because he's not the best candidate to run against Erdogan. I still believe this to this day. If the goal was democracy and democratic governance under a parliamentary system, they would have nominated Ekrem İmamoğlu, which stood a greater chance of turning out voters in favor of the alliance, which may have helped them get 400 plus seats in parliament. I still believe that to this day. But it's all about, for the opposition, who's going to become president, because I don't altogether believe they want to give that up either, right? And I think at this point, it's all about the smaller parties, especially within the alliance, of how many seats they're going to get in parliament. The ones that are ranked, polling less than 1 or 2%, such as DEVA, such as Gelecek Partisi, they just want seats, right? So voters should be at some level disappointed with the opposition simply because they're not interested. The alliance itself is not prioritizing democratic governance as represented by a return to a parliamentary system of government.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to the presidential candidates. If you look at the performance curves of Erdogan and Kılıçdaroğlu, the situation since January approximately, or February, seems to be quite wobbly. But following the earthquake, after a couple of 3 weeks maybe of decline, Erdogan seems to be in the phase of recovery. And credible pollsters, and there are only 3 or 4 of them, if you look at them overall and take the sort of average of what their findings, Kılıçdaroğlu, Erdogan seems to go up, and from late 30s to 40, 42, 43, and Kılıçdaroğlu is only 2 points ahead. So which means more or less, if you take the margin of error, it looks like the neck-to-neck situation over there as well. How though do you explain, despite the tragic results of the disappointment and rage in 10, 11 provinces, earthquake-bound or struck provinces, how do we explain still this solid backing, seemingly solid backing behind Erdogan, first of all?
So that is I think a difficult question to answer overall, but I think I have 2 major points which I've been thinking about trying to explain. So you're right, I think that trend has been showing across the credible polling sort of entities. Here's the 2 that I would suggest. One is, as the election date gets nearer and a widespread cross-section of the electorate looks forward to the future in terms of who is likely to be able to deliver Turkey into a better situation, be it politically or economically or socially, I think what's prevailing right now is this view that Erdogan is the devil that we know. these sort of palliative measures, such as retirement bonuses, not wanting to charge people for the last month of natural gas bills, the increase in the minimum wage, but also just this sort of the turning on of monetary taps seems to be resonating with the electorate, right? But they also look on the other side and look at the Kılıçdaroğlu as a presidential candidate and think, well, do we really think he has the gravitas, the experience, even just the sort of confidence that is required to essentially take Turkey out of this rut that it's in? And I think the overall answer that's coming is no. So that's the first sort of analysis that I have. The second one is slightly more, I think, serious. I think to my knowledge, only Ersin Kalaycıoğlu, a professor of political science, has brought this up, and I wholeheartedly agree with him. Not because I agree with him, because his view on this is based on data and research that suggests, quite convincingly, I might add, that the Turkish electorate is not primarily interested in governance issues or life quality of democratic governance issues, rule of law issues, when it is approaching the ballot box, right? It's basically looking at this and thinks, which candidate is going to give more for me, right? And that's quite a damning sort of perspective if you take it at face value, because that helps explain
When
how
you mean
Erdogan,
candidate, you're talking about candidates of the presidential elections.
absolutely. I mean, they're not evaluating Erdogan or Kılıçdaroğlu primarily on the basis, as in the majority of the electorate. I'm not saying that the majority of the electorate is not evaluating the presidential candidates that's facing before them in terms of which is going to provide me a best democratic sort of governance to uphold Turkey's rule of law, etc. Otherwise, if that was the case, then I think the numbers would be much more heavily skewed and in favor of Kılıçdaroğlu's presidency, who has the right narrative on that, right? He's promising a lot that's actually, based on his Alevi identity to whatever in terms of the right messaging on this. They're looking primarily to Erdogan because they think that if they go to the ballot box, Erdogan is still going to be the best choice for their pocketbook considerations, the economic well-being, above and beyond possibly what Kılıçdaroğlu is offering them. And this is contrary and counter to examples that we see both regionally but also internationally. If you look at voters in Israel, right, people are taking to the streets to protest in Israel, not because they're worried about that they might be worse economically off with a Netanyahu prime ministership, but they're actually concerned about the threat that he presents to the democratic state that Israel is. In fact, we saw protesters on the street with pancards that basically said, we don't want to become like Turkey. We also see this in elections that played out in places like France recently, right, where also voters were concerned about their life quality or democracy quality issues based on the raising of the retirement age. Turkey, it's primarily about, I still think, and I agree with Kalaycıoğlu on this, is we're not really concerned about rule of law. And people just kind of want to forget about this and want to concentrate on the fact that, at the ballot box, people will vote with their conscience in mind for a better democratic Turkey. I simply think that's not a reflection of reality.
That seems to be explaining, perhaps, in the way that you assess this, the wave of populism and the discourse based on populism on both sides, the promises and pledges, basically like raising one hand, the other one raising even more hand about doubling the retirement wages, etc., etc. So that maybe is the election where we see the populism peaking, reaching its peak in Turkish political history. Would that be a correct assessment?
It is, but we should come to expect that. I also just see that as part and parcel of electioneering, right? I mean, there were a lot of voices raised back in November saying, we should be cautious because Erdogan's going to turn on the populism taps, the monetary taps to satisfy the voters. But I've always said, look, that's fair game. This is an election, and governments are allowed to take advantage of incumbency, make outrageous promises, even to the detriment of the country's economic stability. That happens everywhere, and Erdogan is going to use that to the best advantage that he can. I don't necessarily see that's sort of a faux pas on his end. I think that's totally legitimate, and it happens across everywhere. We had that with the Trump presidency here. And the opposition has matched that. And we've also seen that across in Turkish elections, even when Turkey was not in this sort of authoritarian sort of situation that it was in. I remember back in the days when Erdal would sort of hold up a lemon saying you're being squeezed by this sort of administration, whereas Chile would hold up two keys, right? One for
Early
an apartment,
90s.
one for
Early
that's right. I mean, this has
1990s.
always been part and parcel of the election. And Süleyman Demirel back in the day campaigned on the fact that he would reduce the retirement age, and he did, and he basically reduced it down to the mid 40s, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken. I remember this, so that this is kind of part and parcel of the game. What I think viewers have to understand is the degree to which Erdogan will use that to bully the state into actually, moving beyond just promises, but also printing money, bolstering pensions, but also tasking government agencies within the state to actually back his candidacy. I'm more worried about the stuff that he's doing in the background, such as the Supreme Election Council with his constitutional court appointments, how he's institutionally preparing the election to basically ensure his victory should it in this populist sort of claims. He will make those no matter what.
Mm-hmm. And the subject that you're touching upon is interesting, because I know that you remain very concerned about the election safety and possible potential election rigging, vote rigging, etc. And you just mentioned the control of the institutions, which makes me think that you think that Erdogan has the upper hand regarding the control of or engineering of the system, the very election system, that may give him an upper hand. And does it really say a lot about his relative silence, that he will know what he's doing? Do you share those concerns also, that people basically
I do
expect really results that will be a shock for the opposition?
I do share those concerns, and I am on record for thinking that Erdogan does have the upper hand going. Now, for the record, I should also say, I hope I'm sincerely proven wrong, and that that they will put me in the dustbin of opinion holders, subsequently saying, "See, he got this one." I don't mean that in any facetious sense. I honestly do. I believe Tayyip Erdogan is not only a threat for the democratic future of Turkey. I've also come to believe Erdogan is a major threat to democratic stability throughout the world, and I think I do believe he's a regional threat to stability for Western interests. I think I would love to see him go because of the nature of the threat that he continues to present. So that's just on the by. Secondly, people who think like me have, I think, unjustly just been sort of pushed aside and said, look, you're just pessimists. I think that's dismissive to the extent that I'm not just a pessimist with my head buried in the sand, wallowing with sadness and fear and anger, right? There is an entire body of political science literature which basically tries to project how authoritarian regimes can and leaders can and are resilient, right? I position Turkey politically somewhere between a Venezuela and a Hungary, right? There are deep structural problems and impediments in the way of not just a free and fair election that might see a Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu victory, but also a change of power from Erdogan to Kılıçdaroğlu. And we're not just making this up, right? The dismissal of Canan Kaftancıoğlu and her prosecution was to ensure that a CHP officer in a place like Istanbul is not aware of the kind of shenanigans which Kaftancıoğlu uncovered at the Istanbul municipal elections and tried to take and successfully took measures against, such that the AKP did not win Istanbul, right? That person has been removed from that post simply because Erdogan sees that as a threat. They have figured out since the Ankara and Istanbul elections in 2019 of what to avoid at the local level. They've also figured out, and the YSK, the Supreme Election Council, has likely put into place measures whereby the earthquake-stricken zones and voters in those who have left and migrated to other cities, whose votes will not be translated into seats in the districts in which they used to reside. That has now become an issue. The appointment of the YSK members and constitutional court members is likely to ensure that an Erdogan victory, should it be contested, is likely to come about, right? These are not just made up structural factors. These are deeply ingrained. And I should also add, what does it say about the YSK when they have accepted and promulgated the candidacy of Tayyip Erdogan
YSK meaning High
manner.
Supreme Electoral Council for our viewers.
Right. So why is the body, which is the supreme arbiter of which will decide who the winner and loser of the election is, right? Why has it allowed a candidate to become a candidate, which is clearly who is breaching constitutional requirements, whereby every candidate that stands for president has to be a graduate of a 4-year higher education institution, which Tayyip Erdogan is not. Let's just be clear. The Turkish press has really not been onto really highlighted this enough, because they see this as kind of like a red herring or something they don't want to agitate. But it is staring us in plain sight that Erdogan is not a university graduate. It has been proven he is not, yet his candidacy has been accepted by the highest authority in who will determine who's going to be the winner in this election. And I throw that out there simply because it's been dismissed, quite sort of just forgotten about. And we're expecting a free and fair election, right? We have seen foreign correspondents being dismissed from Turkey. We have seen the end to tenure of Deutsche Welle's existence in Turkey. We don't need to talk about the relative state of press freedoms in Turkey. We don't necessarily know if foreign observers will be allowed to come and participate at the ballot box. So when we talk about election security in Turkey, what I've seen on Turkish television, on good programs and good journalists such as like Orta Sayfa, they've been discussing it a little bit more recently. But initially, election security, as far as they were concerned, was, are they going to use the ink that's going to be put on people's thumbs at the end of the voting process? I mean, come on, right? And then to be dismissing sort of people as just pessimists, I find this really disingenuous, and the ignoring of both literature, but also the significant number of structural impediments that have been basically put up to ensure an Erdogan victory. And really to hamstring the political opposition going forward. Now, I'm not necessarily, putting my money on saying, regardless, Erdogan will prevail. I'm just saying the overall likelihood of an Erdogan third term is more likely than not, and we should be very aware of this going forward.
Yet, I have 2 questions more. Yet the perceptions are that regarding the election campaign, the opposition bloc leader, candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, is having quite an impact with these kind of, short spots that he posts every day in the social media, every night at a certain specific time, every night a different subject, which those people who observers have the perception of getting to the address that he aims at, and on the other hand, there are still those who question that election campaign is being delayed, that no opposition candidate or representative was really spending the aid feast in the earthquake areas, etc., etc. Even if you disagree with the perception of efficiency of Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's spots, what do you think that opposition is not doing, in your opinion? What it should do? What is missing there, if you think so?
That's a good question, Yavuz. And let me say this: I think if we existed in a situation where Turkey was a country where relative free and fair elections were going to be held, look, I think what Kılıçdaroğlu is probably doing is the right formula at this finally, right? I think just hitting hard home on economic sort of pocketbook issues is something starting to resonate, even with his identity-based questions. I think that's interesting, but that's not the state of the country that we are heading into elections in. What we are seeing right now, unfortunately, is a messaging that may not necessarily be enough to carry him over the threshold, because the country is going way in a less than free and less than fair sort of manner. What else could he be doing? Well, my primary suggestion to the opposition would be to ensure provincial party representatives who are as capable, aware, and involved as Canan Kaftancıoğlu was in the municipal elections. Put into position people who can monitor elections and electioneering at the ballot box and precinct level to ensure that malfeasance and chicanery does not happen. The other thing on the perspective of campaigning is absolutely continue to hit home and on the issues of pocketbook, corruption, right? And hit hard home on that, because voters are still convinced that given a choice, that they still think Erdogan may be the best choice for them to deliver and raise them out of this economic sort of malaise that the country is in, which is sad. The other thing that we don't know about is the extent to which foreign election interference will have a bearing on this election, and that's hard to say. And what I mean by that, obviously, is what the Russian factor is. Not just myself, but even the political opposition is aware of this. The Russians have interfered in every single election that they deem to be significant to their outcomes. From the United States to France to Hungary to whatever, Russians have interfered everywhere. They will interfere in this election. The extent to which they'll be effective, I don't know. But to the extent that the United States and European governments have experience in seeing how this interference happens, they would be well served to share that with their Turkish counterparts, both the government as well as the political opposition, so that we can be ready for that.
Final question. Regardless of who ends up as the victorious in the presidential elections, do you expect any changes in foreign policy?
I do, and I think you're right. Regardless of who it is, I think that we should expect some sort of change at the Erdogan level. If he is going to stay in power, then we should remain accustomed. And I should say that the United States is preparing for a third Erdogan term. Again, decision-making level made virtually at the realm of him and some of his close lieutenants. But that being said, what we're expecting to see is possibly sort of placatory measures put out to Washington and Europe that indicates that they're interested in turning a fresh leaf with the West. One of the things that I've heard that they might be interested in doing is basically divesting the country of its S-400 missile system, and also obviously accepting, ratifying Sweden's membership into NATO, but not much more beyond that as far as I can see. They would like to see obviously more cooperation and receptive sort of cooperation towards Turkey's priorities under Erdogan in Syria, which I don't think is going to happen, but nevertheless they have that. Under a Kılıçdaroğlu presidency, I expect similar things, but I'm also tempering my sort of expectations, because regardless of who is president, there is a widespread sort of belief in the Turkish electorate that we should not be too sort of conciliatory towards Western demands vis-a-vis Turkey's position in Syria, America's relationship with the PYD-YPG. I think they're essentially going to basically want to insist and keep some of these priorities alive. But I also think, a Kılıçdaroğlu presidency would be much better at toning down this sort of antagonistic rhetoric towards the United States and the West. I think we're likely to see more sort of cooperation, but at least a lessening of belligerent rhetoric in the Eastern Mediterranean towards Greece and Cyprus, much more sort of constructive tone with the European Union. But I also expect to see, immediate moves on Swedish membership of NATO, not to mention possibly moves on divesting Turkey of its S-400s. But these will be absolutely necessary if Turkey seeks to establish or re-engage with the West, particularly, as you say earlier on, if Turkey is going to face some very difficult economic circumstances following the elections, regardless of who is in power, Turkey will need the assistance of Western creditor institutions, regardless, maybe the IMF. And for that to happen, Turkey needs to really substantively engage in its rebuilding of relationship with the West.
Sinan Ciddi was my guest in Turkey today. Sinan Ciddi is the director of Turkey program in the Defense of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, based in Washington, D.C. Thank you for this conversation, Sinan.
Thank you.